The Arizona Board of Regents meets in Tucson and hears from students after another round of budget cuts.
I'm really sad at the way Arizona has treated higher education. We really don't value it as a society. And I think that's unfortunate and really dangerous for our economy.
A former regent says it's a constitutional right. Higher education should be more affordable.
I've always been convinced, and the presidents who disagree with me, they could do more to reduce the cost, to keep the tuition down.
The challenges of affording a college education. This is Arizona Week. The Arizona legislature recently cut $99 million from higher education. The Arizona Board of Regents manages the legislature's decisions. And this week is in Tucson, hearing firsthand from students who are faced with rising costs of tuition and fees. Former U.S. Senator Dennis DeConcini recently served on the Arizona Board of Regents, and here's what he has to say about the continued cuts in funding.
It is outrageous, and particularly when it doesn't have to be that way if we had the courage of our political leaders. And you know, it's hard. I've spent 18 years and 20-some years in elected office, and it's hard when you have to ask the general public to pay something for someone else, whatever it is. And certainly it's welfare, it's very controversial, and education not quite so much because everybody has gone to school and parents are involved, but it's still, and our state is just bogged down with ultra conservatives that don't want to pay for public education anymore. They're being sued, as you know, the state's been sued and successfully got a judgment against the state for not following a proposition that was passed. And while I was on the Board of Regents for 8 years, 5 of those years, tuition went up an average of above 8%, sometimes 15%, because the legislature and the governor cut very badly. And I understand recessions, and I understand the need to, to reduce expenses. But when you do it with college education or K through 12 education, you're hurting your economy. You're causing more pain and more suffering and more sacrifice, and it's really a sad thing for Arizona, because Arizona has a history of contributing to education. When I went to school, like I always say, way last century, the state paid over 80% of it. Now I think it's down to 11% or 12%. And so it's just very unfortunate. Our universities, however, have succeeded because we have tremendous leadership, and unfortunately the board has increased tuition substantially. I opposed those tuitions when I was there because I just felt there had to be a better way. And with federal funds drying up, it doesn't look like it's going to get better.
What's the future of Arizona's landscape if students are not getting educated in universities and not pursuing higher education?
Well, it's a shame because Arizona's on the lower tier of every measurement of education. Dropping out, not getting through in 8 years, cost is one of the few areas that we're considered one of the still good investments. But if you're a blue collar family and you had to pay $11,000 plus a year for your college tuition, and even if you have a job, you're not going to make much more than that as a student. Now, if you got parents that can help you or relatives, fine, and the federal programs are tremendous, the Pell Grants and other ones, and relied on it immensely. But you have to pay a lot of those back. And the scholarship funds that our universities have created and the Board of Regents have insisted we raised, when I was there, raised it from 11 to 17% of all tuition dollars are set aside for scholarship for needy students. I don't want to drag this on, but a good point. The state of Arizona, when I was there, and I don't think it's gone up or down, put in $10 million for financial aid to students. You know, Texas, a very conservative state, puts in $480 million. Now that's a big state. You know, New York puts in over $500 million for student education, you know, for financial aid. And though it's comparing maybe apples with oranges with the size of it, but you look at Arizona, you know, it's just a shame. And our legislature is to blame. And I'm not being partisan here, even though they happen to be controlled by the Republicans. They don't care. They don't think it's necessary. And I'm sure they have their arguments, but they don't. And unfortunately, our governors, last two governors, have just been treacherous. We have a governor here who's a fine young man. He's been a successful businessman, and he's, you know, says he wants education. And what does he do? He cuts the budget $92 million when there's a surplus of over $300 million. I don't know why. I don't know why.
Going back to the constitutional right to be able to make college as affordable as possible, that had to have been a fight that you fought when you were in the region,
did.
saying that we've got to remember this. Why isn't it on the front burner for these regions?
You know, it's a good question, and it usually comes down to a couple of things. One is the capability of making the case before the Supreme Court. And there have been some cases brought before that. And there has been ruled that the Board of Regents have acted in that capacity in one case that I'm aware of, and maybe others. But the argument, in my opinion, and I read the case, was not the argument I would make. Not that I'm the most brilliant lawyer or scholar by any means, and I've talked to other people. You could make a better case. There's some reluctance, always has been, on the Board of Regents for the state agency to be suing the Arizona government and, in essence, the legislature and the governor for not following the Constitution. And now the board is made up of Republican appointees, and they're not about to do that, in my opinion. And you know, when it was made up of Democratic appointments, I was for suing them. We just couldn't get the votes to, and the legal advice that was enough to get the votes to convince the majority of the regents that it was worthwhile taking that action.
A lot of what we hear right now is, why are the presidents of the universities paid so much?
Well, it's a good question, and I've struggled with it, and I struggle with what we pay our coaches. You know, when you're paying millions of dollars for a coach, then you're asking students for 15% raise in tuition. And it's the reality of college life and the competition, in my opinion. And to get the quality teachers like President Hart and President Crow and our new president at NAU, it's a competitive nature.
The last round of state cuts resulted in the loss of more than 300 jobs at the University of Arizona, and the U of A will receive nearly $30 million less in state funding. Manny Felix, you are the ASUA student body president here at the University of Arizona.
Last time I checked, yes.
Thank you for joining us today.
Of course, thank you for having me.
The Board of Regents are in town, and of course everyone always thinks they're going to be talking about important issues that affect tuition. What are you hearing from your peers here at the U of A about their concerns over rising costs?
There's definitely a lot of discussion. In fact, I feel like this A-Board meeting, there's a lot of different discussions going on. There's discussions about tuition, about the matrix, about the three universities, and also about the new funding model. So there's definitely a lot of discussion going on that always ties back to the tuition and to the budget cuts that we experienced last year. So I think, yes, there is discussion about it, but there's focus on a lot of how we moving forward rather than on the past. So I feel like there's a lot more focus on that.
And how do we move forward? Because we haven't necessarily seen declining numbers in enrollment, but I think people are maybe taking less classes so they can also work while they go to school.
Exactly. And I definitely have seen that, and just, you know, from listening to conversations from fellow peers and just observing, I can definitely see that. But I think a very good way to move forward is through the new funding model, which is, you know, currently the state funds about 34% about an in-state Arizona student's tuition. And to slowly increase that amount to 50%, closer to 50%, that would be a monumental thing to do, in my perspective. And I think that is a good way to start for now. But I mean, that's the way that we measure matrix, the way that we measure the quality of an education of a student, that's also being talked about and discussed today. I feel that everyone has their own perspective on what constitutes as a quality education, and everyone has their own opinion on that. But I think it's the way that we measure that. That's what we need to come into a consensus. And I think that's what ABOR is really focusing on today, just trying to figure out how do we measure the quality of an education and the matrix from the 3 different universities.
So you work with ABOR, you also work with a lot of the administrative folks here at the U of A.
Yeah.
Does everyone seem to understand the student's perspective and the fact that it is more expensive to go to school nowadays?
It definitely is, and administrators always keep that in mind, and I believe ABOR does as well. And it's not the fact, no one wants to see the tuition increase. If it were, the goal is to have tuition as free as possible, but there are unfortunately sometimes that you unfortunately have to raise tuition in order to, in the future, make it more affordable, and for everyone to receive a better quality education, to be more successful after college and get a job, and just the story. And so I believe we do listen to the students' concerns, and we try to accommodate as much as possible. But then again, we have to make decisions that are for the best interest of the students. So I think ABOR and Board of Administration do a good job at that. Always keep the best interest of the students in mind.
The state or the legislature, the Board of Regents, the governor often take heat for making these cuts to higher education.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think maybe sometimes students expect too much of the state when they're trying to earn a college degree?
I think we always expect everything to go perfectly, and then when something goes wrong, that's when everyone just really starts paying attention to issues. And I feel like that's the biggest downfall that we have. So last year when the budget cuts happened, you just read the headlines that say 100 million budget cuts in Arizona higher education. So you think, what? If they're not investing in my education, then why should I show an interest in my education? But then again, there's a lot more that goes into that I feel people, instead of, there's definitely, it's unfortunate that the budget cuts were made in the first place, but I think it's, like I said, how do we move forward from this point on? And we should focus on that rather than stay stuck in what already happened. So I think, we can be upset about it, and I was personally upset about it as well. But now I'm looking towards the future, how we can help, how we can slowly try to gain that money back, try to get that money that we were cut and bring it back to higher education. Or how is it that we can help Arizona grow as a state, and just the education system, how we can see the quality of our education in Arizona go higher.
The Arizona Daily Wildcat is a student-run newspaper, and this fall published an editorial questioning the decisions made by state leaders to cut higher education. Here's Opinions editor Nicholas Havey.
We talked about the dramatic increases to tuition in the past 10 years. We have had definitely the most in terms of inflation and not really rising other costs, rise in tuition per states in the United States, as well as simultaneously the most decreased spending per student head for institutions of higher learning. So it was kind of we're spending so much more and really receiving so much less situation that we were a little bit shocked to really look at the numbers, especially following the spring budget cuts from the governor, as well as the reveal of the ABOR plan to approve salary increases, as well as the increased expenditures for the 2020 plan and the 2025 plans for increased retention.
The Board of Regents will say we have to do this because the legislature mandates these cuts, the governor signs off on them. Some people might wonder, is it fair to go after the regions, or should the real concern be at the president to accept these bonuses maybe?
Yeah, I think that was a little bit more of our slant, that we were disappointed in them as the heads of the institutions, that they were willing to take these raises. And I don't think necessarily that any of us were particularly disappointed in ABOR. They're just trying to maintain the bottom line of the public university system in Arizona, keep it profitable so that it can sustain itself in the wake of these horrible budget cuts that we're experiencing. But that the presidents really should not have, as the heads of these institutions, taken these raises. Obviously, raises to their compensation couldn't have saved the over 300 jobs that were cut in the past fiscal year from our university in particular. An increased 20,000 in housing allowance and car allowance, and an increased about, I want to say like 75, I can't remember off the top of my head now, in salary for Hart isn't going to pay for 300 tenure-track faculty members or 300 full-time staff members. But it's just the principle of the matter that they, as the heads of these institutions and as university presidents, have been in academia long enough to understand that they are there to make a difference and provide a service and not to get an increasing paycheck at the end of every quarter.
Do you think students maybe expect too much or ask too much of the state and the students should be taking on more of these costs themselves?
I don't think that students expect too much of the state. I personally am a benefactor of the state's past plans to get more undergraduate enrollment at our state universities. I'm the last class that has the full percentage of the Ames scholarship. Now it is less than a quarter of what it used to be, and it can barely cover course costs and mandatory fees and all the stuff that's being built around tuition that's not part of tuition that ABOR is approving. So we have things like the student services fee, the health and wellness fee, the land grant fee for university expansion, the IT board fee, the freshman fee for freshman students. All of these fees that are on top of tuition that are not explicitly part of tuition, and we're moving to more and more of these fees. For instance, we have in the BFA film program, those students are paying probably about $2,000 in course fees over the course of their undergraduate years so that they don't have to spend $15,000 on their senior project, which is a film. So really the cost of education, which used to be tuition and that's about it, is expanding to, well, tuition isn't enough anymore. We need that to pay for all of these things. So now we also need you to pay fees for whatever you want to do. If you want to take an online course, that's a fee. If you want to take a course that's online and in person, that's a fee. It's just a lot of add-ons that aren't necessarily part of, really, I think, the public service that public education was built to be.
At this week's Board of Regents meeting, graduate students presented a petition protesting low wages, tuition increases, and employee layoffs. Here's Sarah Netherton, president of the Graduate and Professional Student Council at the U of A.
There's a lot that come with different circumstances in life, but across the board, a lot of it is funding. We aren't eligible for a lot of the financial aid that you can get as an undergrad. And you can work, which is good, but that also makes it more challenging to complete your studies on time. So there's just a balance that we have to walk as far as paying for education. And given that we have a lot of PhD students who don't finish in less than 6 or 8 years, that's a lot of funding for a very long time.
And I read a report that some of the numbers are lower than the average levels in Pima County. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Because we're not actually employees. We're student workers, which is a wonderful opportunity because it does enhance your education, but it definitely is a part-time job, and so you don't make enough to live on.
It's pretty common for graduate students to be a little bit older, maybe have a family life, have some other experiences. You're a single mom with 2 small children. How do you manage? You just earned your master's, and now you're seeking a
doctoral degree. Yes.
A doctoral degree. So how is it that you manage this balance of having a life and being a student and having this dream of serving in a greater capacity?
Very carefully, with a lot of time management. But at this point, it's a necessity for me. I got divorced and realized that in our economy, I could not make a living with a bachelor's degree. And my undergrad is in sociology. I have a history in social work, and I wanted to do social work in Tucson, and I can't support my kids on one income. And so I went back to school. And so it's kind of an odd catch-22 that in order to be with your children, in order to actually raise a family, you need higher education. But that whole process is really difficult to balance with a family. And I was really surprised when I got to the university. I got my undergrad here, but when I actually came back more recently to learn that what used to be non-traditional students are now the majority, that we have fewer traditional undergrad students who continue into grad school than we do single parents who are returning to get their master's. And so kind of re-envisioning what higher education needs to look like, I think is going to be key in order to compete. But it's a necessity, especially for single families.
It sounds complicated. You just said it's a necessity.
Yeah.
Why persevere and push it? I mean, some people might say, change your way of life, cut your spending in other places, but why push for this extra degree in this new career?
Well, I tried cutting my spending, and I tried, doing everything else. It is just not feasible. There is no, you're living so far below the poverty line that you can't live. I would have had to foreclose on my house. I sold my car. I, did all of the things that I could do to make things work, and it's just not feasible.
This is important for you to finish your program of study so
Yeah.
you can have the career that you dreamed of.
Yes, yeah, and so I can provide a family and provide for my family, that I'm not working, 80 or 100 hours a week at, 2 or 3 separate jobs and never see my kids. And so I'm making the trade-off now and giving up a lot of things now so that I can have a more stable life later.
And the buzz now with my colleague Christopher Conover here at Arizona Public Media. Christopher, thanks for joining me. A lot to talk to this week. Let's start though with higher education in the Ninth Circuit.
The Arizona Student Association in 2013 filed suit against the Board of Regents because the board voted to change the way the fee that funds the Arizona Student Association is collected. And the Student Association is now essentially broke as a result. The students claim it was retaliation because they actively campaigned in 2012 for the extension of that half-cent sales tax. Governor Brewer, who got it put in, was very much against the extension. The governor sits as a member of the Board of Regents, and they say that because they were opposing the governor actively on the campaign trail, if you will, that the Board of Regents retaliated. Now, a lower court, a federal court, threw it out, said this is not a First Amendment retaliation case, and threw the case out. The students appealed to the U.S. Ninth Circuit, and this week they heard the arguments. I watched the arguments, and 2 of the judges seemed to say that they believe this is a retaliation case. Now, just because judges push their questioning that particular direction from the bench is no guarantee that that's how their ruling will come down. If they rule in favor of the students, all it means is it goes back to the lower court, federal court, and we have a trial.
Could it mean more dollars at universities later on, down the road?
It could mean if the students win, eventually, they could get money again for the Arizona Student Association. It was a $2 what was called negative checkoff, which meant when students got their tuition bill, it said, if you don't want to pay this $2 to the Arizona Student Association, check here. Traditionally, nobody does negative checkoffs. It's a very small number. So the Student Association got a lot of money. This is a lobbying group for students and things like that.
Okay. Marijuana also in the news just this week.
Marijuana, just this week, Friday, had an opinion from the Arizona Supreme Court, a unanimous opinion regarding medical marijuana and DWI or DUI. 2 people were arrested for driving under the influence, and they were medical marijuana card holders, which means legally they could have medical marijuana. They were arrested for DUI. They tested positive for the metabolites of marijuana in their blood. They challenged that arrest, saying, we can legally have those metabolites in our blood because we can legally have marijuana. It went all the way to the Arizona Supreme Court, and the Arizona Supreme Court said, yes, you can legally have those metabolites in your blood if you are a medical marijuana card holder. Those compounds stay in your blood for a long time. So they said you could legally have them in your blood, but they didn't overturn the convictions. What they said was, if you are impaired and you are on medical marijuana, well, you are impaired then, regardless of the legality of having the marijuana. What it allows legal medical marijuana users to do is use an affirmative defense to prove that yes, they have the metabolites in their blood, but they were not impaired necessarily, but they have to prove that in court.
Are you allowed to drive if you are using medical marijuana?
It falls under everything like alcohol and all other drugs. If you are impaired and you are driving, you are violating the law. Whether it is alcohol is legal if you're over the age of 21, but you cannot drive impaired, and it falls into the same category.
Okay. Governor Doug Ducey in the news this week joining other governors across the country saying no more refugees at this point right now without properly vetting them. Where is that now?
It's an interesting thing. Early in the week, the governor sent a letter to the White House saying, we don't want any more refugees in Arizona. Not Syrian, not Afghani, whatever. He said no more refugees. He ended up on a conference call with White House officials trying to explain his side, and they explained their side, and their side was there is a process for vetting them, and we're sending refugees to the various states as we always have.
Does he have legal right to do this as governor of Arizona?
Not really. He says he does. But if you go back and look at the history, very recent history of court cases, SB 1070, the U.S. Supreme Court was very clear when it said immigration is the purview of the federal government, not the individual states. That came out of SB 1070. The Obama administration is using that same argument over the latest immigration arguments going to the Supreme Court. Ducey today, Friday, sent another letter with additional governors, 27, all Republicans, to the White House, not only asking for no more refugees, but suspending all resettlement of Syrian refugees. So a second letter has now gone.
Okay, this story getting a lot of attention. Also, reports of men from the Middle East being arrested along the Arizona-Mexico border. We'll watch that and see how it transforms. Christopher Conover, thank you so much for your analysis, and that's our program. For all of us at Arizona Public Media, thanks so much for joining us.